This is the web transcription service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. At our Speakers' Luncheon of November 15th, Canadian historical writer Mark Zuehlke discussed his new book, The Cinderella Campaign, concerning the Canadian battles for the Channel ports in 1944.
Okay, well, thank you for having me here, and thank you, Ed, for organizing this and bringing all these people together. So you might be wondering about the title of this book, and I'll just say right now that all will be revealed in due course. For now, I want to emphasize that the Cinderella Campaign is intended to bring a largely neglected but very important and costly Canadian Army operation out of obscurity and put back into the light into our national memory. The campaign to defeat the German fortresses guarding the French Channel ports was given only passing attention by the Army's official historian, Colonel C.P. Stacey, in the Victory Campaign. And as a result, most following historians writing about World War II have either mentioned the campaign not at all, or just in passing as part of an overview of the entire Northwest Europe campaign. So the Cinderella Campaign is really the first and only detailed account of this campaign to have been written. And I want to give you a contextual overview of the campaign, but the full story, of course, is to be found in the book. The Cinderella story begins immediately following the end of the Normandy campaign, which ended on August 21st, 1944, when Canadian and Polish troops closed the Falaise Gap. And it's through this gap that a broken German army had been frantically attempting to escape destruction. With the gap closed, thousands of men, animals, and vehicles were trapped and left to either surrender or die. These final days of the Normandy campaign had been a disaster for the German army. No more than 50,000 Germans escaped from the pocket of the Falaise pocket, as it was called, while approximately 400,000 Germans had died, been wounded, or taken prisoner since the Allies had landed on the Normandy beaches on June 6, 1944. The remnants of the German army could only flee with the Allies nipping at their heels. 1st Canadian Army joined this pursuit. They were on the left flank over by the sea, going up on this map. But it was here, in the area that the 1st Canadian Army were moving forward, that the Germans were best able to fight back, as the divisions that faced the Canadians were not those who had been trapped inside the Falaise pocket. They were outside of the pocket and were therefore well organized still and had coherent leadership. To the right of the Canadian 2nd British Army raced out of France and into Belgium, and the Americans blasted across the open plains to liberate Paris on August 25th, after a stunning advance from Normandy that was largely unopposed. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force Commander General Dwight Eisenhower in the center of this photo, and 21st Army Group Commander Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery in his distinctive beret, and 12th Army Group Commander General Omar Bradley now all agreed that the main push from Normandy should be toward the German border. They thought that if they could break into Germany quickly, that the war would be over by Christmas. Wars are always going to be over by Christmas. You ever notice that? And it never really happens. But it's always a grand thing to work towards. But the Allies faced a serious handicap. All of their fuel, ammunition, replacement vehicles, weapons, reinforcements, and every other bit of scrap of material that they needed had to be still landed on the invasion beaches and dragged across the sand and then put into trucks to take them forward to where the advancing troops were. A very inefficient system. With the American and British forces racing ever further away from the beaches, keeping them supplied became a critical challenge. Well, the Red Ball Express, as the Americans dubbed their massive supply convoy system, did amazing work getting fuel as these trucks are carrying up to the tanks. leading the advance there was simply insufficient quantities. They were arriving with too little supplies to keep this huge army of the Americans, the British, and the Canadians operating with everything that they needed. And you can see these trucks are carrying fuel, but of course you're burning tons and tons of fuel just to move that fuel forward. So it's a losing game in many ways. What the Allies really needed was a major port. On September 2nd, British 30th Corps rolled into Antwerp, and it looked like they had one. However, Montgomery and Eisenhower at this point have begun to fixate on the drive toward Germany, and they decide on a critical gamble. They will launch Operation Market Garden, which is the drive to the Rhine at Arnhem and crossing and the famous bridge too far, if you've read that book or seen that movie. And they will do that by shifting 30th British Corps away from Antwerp to be part of Operation Market Garden. And there's a 75-mile long estuary that runs from Antwerp to the sea, and that remains in German hands. They decide to not wrest it away from the Germans, which they could have done immediately after the September 2nd liberation of Antwerp. Instead, they'll wait for the 1st Canadian Army to come forward, and then they'll clear the estuary at that time. Here you can clearly see the British advance in lines, and I can't get on there with my pointer. And you'll see that Antwerp is inside the British lines, but that body of water running to the coast is not. It's in German hands. And at the same time as they're going to ask 1st Canadian Army to get them Antwerp, they also want the Canadians to take the other ports on the channel, what they call the channel ports along the French coast. And that's to have priority over clearing the Scheldt estuary. And the story of the grueling Canadian fight to gain control of the Scheldt estuary I told earlier in a book called The Terrible Victory. What's significant for our purposes here is that Montgomery decides that the French ports are more important than Antwerp, and these ports are namely Le Havre, Dieppe, Dunkirk, Boulogne, and Calais. He thinks that even if he gets one of these ports, he'll have sufficient capacity to supply his army as it breaks into Germany in Market Garden. And so the Cinderella Campaign began. Now by this time, Canadians were calling themselves the Cinderella Army, and the reasons were quite logical. While the Americans and British had been swanning across France and Belgium, liberating one city after another, each of them had their own capital that they got to liberate, the Canadians had been meeting stiff resistance along the coast. Montgomery and Eisenhower also put the Canadians at the back of the line in terms of priority on all supplies. So the Canadians see themselves as always being given the necessary but dirty jobs, while also hardly receiving any resources to carry those jobs out, and of course, getting none of the glory. So a bit like Cinderella in the fairy tale. The first challenge that the 1st Canadian Army faced was just reaching the Seine River. And as I mentioned, the Germans facing the Canadians in 1st British Corps, which was serving as part of 1st Canadian Army, were not on the run. They were fighting holding actions to contain the Canadian advance, and while they were containing it, that enabled the Germans to undertake a ferrying operation across the Seine River near the city of Rouen and evacuate as much in the way of supplies, tanks, vehicles as they possibly could. They knew there was no question of actually stopping the Canadian advance because the British Army and the Americans had outflanked them. But they thought that they could at least hold for long enough, and they weren't in disarray. The Germans offered Canadians very stiff fights whenever possible. At the village of Berchtesgaden, pictured here, the Black Watch, who often were an unfortunate regiment, suffered more than 100 casualties, of which 13 were fatal, in a fight that started late on August 25th and raged throughout to the end of the day that followed. The regiment finished August 26th with just 176 officers and men still fit for combat, when they should have numbered about 800. They were not alone in such weakness of numbers, for the other two battalions serving in 5th Brigade of 2nd Division were in almost equally poor shape. Calgary Highlanders counted 205 men, Le Régiment de Maisonneuve 246. The entire brigade could field only 627 infantrymen, when it should have been about 2,550. The situation was about as dire for the other two brigades in 2nd Canadian Infantry Division, and really for the entire 2nd Canadian Corps. Infantry reinforcements simply were not coming forward fast enough at a rate that could match the losses that they were suffering due to combat and illness. It was this badly depleted 2nd Division that soon became entangled in a chaotic fight for control of the dense Forêt de Lalande on the south bank of the Seine River, directly opposite the city of Rouen. You can see in this photo there's a couple of overpassing railway tracks. Those were operational still in World War II, and because of the force denseness, and you can see how incredibly dense it was, they become the only actual landscape markings that the Canadians can orient themselves by. And the Canadians are down in those trees, and their forward observation officers of the artillery regiments that are with them have absolutely no idea where they are. They can't figure out, so they can't call in artillery in support because they have no idea where to direct it to. And even when they did, you know, they were often as close to hitting themselves as they were hitting the Germans. And meanwhile, the Germans have had years to study this force. They know exactly where they are. They had always planned to fight a battle here if they had to. And they have crack SS infantry and tanks in the operating inside the forest. The tanks use basically little forestry roads that ran through there in order to maneuver, and they know which ones lead where. And our tankers get in there and they don't know where any of the roads go, so they're just wandering aimlessly along the roads. So it was an incredibly difficult country to fight in, and where the forest abutted the river, you have just a very narrow road, and then you have a little line of houses running along there. And you'll see these white cliffs, those are chalk, and the Germans were able to easily bore out basically caves into the cliffs and then mount machine guns inside these caves. And so they were able to control that road. Again, the Canadians weren't able to utilize the river road to outflank the force. So they were stuck with having to fight inside the forest, which they did in a very chaotic battle that ran for 4 days. And they were locked in heavy fighting, and they never knew what tree they were approaching might have the Germans behind it, and they never knew when they were moving along those cliffs by the river where the Germans were either. Now for the Germans, the battle finally ends, I should say. It ends after 4 days, as I said, and it cost 2nd Division 577 casualties. And you can remember how weak they were when they went into this battle. So that was a serious hit. They lost about 2/3 of the men that they actually put in there. For the Germans, holding the forest had been vital to keeping that ferry crossing point open, as I said, but they still suffered a lot of damage. They managed to evacuate about 25,000 vehicles during the time that the Canadians were trying to close in on the river. But most of those vehicles were horse-drawn wagons. And when the Canadians crossed the Seine, this is what they saw on both sides of the river. They saw it was clogged with destroyed vehicles and corpses of horses and men, most of them all destroyed by tactical fighters who had come in, Typhoons and Spitfires, that had just kept the river and turned it into a slaughterhouse. At this time, the Germans flee, that they can no longer offer much in the way of organized resistance. So they flee to reach the Scheldt estuary and seek shelter on its northern banks. Behind, they leave the Channel port fortresses of Le Havre, Dieppe, Boulogne, Calais, and Dunkirk. Each was expected by Hitler to hold out to the last man and bullet. But the garrison at Dieppe doesn't have much determination to fight. So as the Germans are streaming past them, the Germans in Dieppe join the retreating army and leave the city open. Dieppe was, of course, of significant importance to the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division because its regiments had been involved in the disastrous raid of August 19th, 1942, where 913 Canadians had been killed or wounded and another 1,964 taken prisoner on what was the Army's most costly day of the war. So the honor of liberating Dieppe was given to 2nd Division, and on September 2nd, they, led by all of the regimental pipe bands, the men marched through the streets of Dieppe, past thousands of cheering citizens. With the garrison at Dieppe, while the garrison at Dieppe fled, it did so before Hitler formally issued orders on September 3rd that the other ports be reinforced and formally designated as fortresses. In reality, it was too late for reinforcement, so the Germans within each of these fortresses would have to just make do on their own and in isolation from the others, because we quickly cut off the coast roads on each side of those fortresses so that they couldn't send troops back and forth. But they still had a lot going for them. If you look at that fortification, that bunker, that's a very strong position. When you visit these bunkers, and a lot of them are still there today, you'll find that concrete is anywhere from 3 to 4 feet thick. It's all with rebar in it, so it's all the artillery does is just bounce off. It can't shatter these. Since conquering France in 1940, German engineers had embarked on constructing a bastion of coastal defenses, especially in the Pas-de-Calais area, where Dunkirk, Calais, and Boulogne were situated. The blue dots there are strong points, and the yellow ones are artillery positions. You can see they're very strongly defended. Particularly strong defenses on the northeast side of Dunkirk. You'll see there's just a mass of positions there. Now the weakest garrison was 7,500 strong at Calais, and the strongest was 12,000 at Le Havre. Well, the quality of these troops was relatively poor. They didn't really need to do much except sit in their bunkers and fight. So they didn't need to maneuver, they didn't need to have really strong leadership. Their job was really to sit in there, fight until they died. And that's something they were perfectly capable of if they decided to do so. The Canadians quickly learned how hard these fortresses are to crack when 2nd Division attacks Dunkirk in what they hoped would be a flanking attack where they would come in from both sides, drive into Dunkirk through the fortifications, using just the normal Canadian repertoire of artillery, tanks, and infantry. And that's what they're hoping to do. The attack starts on September 7th, and it very rapidly stalls. They find themselves forced to fight in extremely open and exposed country. And the ground, they discover, has been laced with thousands upon thousands of mines, which the Germans started laying in 1940 and continued to do so right up until the wee days before the battle. So it's huge minefields, and the only thing the Canadians have to detect them are the fellow in the front there with his little mine detector. So the process of trying to find and lift the mines is overwhelming. And the Canadians quickly start taking heavy casualties and remain only chipping at the Dunkirk fortress perimeter. Ultimately, Montgomery, after seeing this fighting going on for a week, lost his patience, and he left. It said, we'll just give it up, we'll rope it off. And they surround the Dunkirk with a holding force, and it's made up of the 1st Independent Czechoslovakian Brigade is brought in to do that. And they remain containing Dunkirk until the Germans surrender on May 9th, 1945. Abandoning any thoughts that the port fortresses could be taken by regular infantry supported by just normal tanks and artillery, 1st Canadian Army now accepts that each port is going to have to be taken in turn. And it'll have to be backed up with the technological wizardry of 79th British Armoured Division and its so-called funnies. Now pictured here is in the center is a bridge-laying tank called a scissors tank that could roll up to a canal or river and drop the span in place and create an instant bridge. They were quite good, as long as the river or canal was not too wide, because that's the width that you got. Then there was the petard, a tank retrofitted with a 12-inch gun that fired a 40-pound canister shell, capable of destroying concrete walls, such as were common in the fortification bunkers. The crocodile, fitted with a flamethrower that drew its fuel from the towed trailer just visible in the bottom of the photo, was one of their real aces in their stack of cards. The tank would roll up close to one of the bunkers, and if the Germans continued to resist, could squirt the flame right through a firing aperture and set everyone inside aflame and or exhaust the oxygen inside. So in most cases, when the crocodile rattled up towards the bunker, the Germans decided it was time to throw in the towel and surrender, rather than face that flame. German soldiers, understandably, were always very afraid of the flamethrowers that when we brought them forward. Because of the dense minefields, possibly the most important funny during the fortress assaults was the crab or flail tank. It's fitted with the chains. It's the one that's closest to you, or closest to this side. It's fitted with a rotating drum and steel chains, quite long, sometimes 20, 30 feet long. And they literally beat the ground ahead of the tank, detonating mines, and then this way would open a path through the minefield along which infantry and follow-on tanks could pass. Because of the solid defenses, heavy artillery regiments were deployed. Most of them were British, but there were some Canadian ones as well, to carry out complex fire plans against the targeted German fortifications. But the most devastating weapon brought against the fortresses were the heavy bombers of RAF Bomber Command. Each port city was to be subjected to extensive aerial bombardment. Although the intention was to pinpoint German fortifications, and Bomber Command assured the Canadian Army that they could do so, the reality was completely different. This is a photo of Canadian engineers clearing rubble in Boulogne after the battle, and you can see the city has been pretty much devastated. I came across this photo in Director of Heritage History, Department of National Defense's archives, in a folder of a number of different photos of Boulogne. And what interested me with her is the city had been evacuated, and at the time this photo was taken, there weren't supposed to be any civilians in the city. Yet we have this very well-dressed young woman walking through the ruins of the city, and I wonder, how the heck did she get there? What's her story? And we'll never know. Yes. The final addition to supporting the attacking troops was provided by the Canadian Armoured Personnel Carrier Squadron, which was created in August 1944. To enable infantry to advance apace with tanks and provide some protection from machine gun and artillery fire, Major General Guy Simmons had come up with the idea of creating armoured personnel carriers by removing the gun from American-made M7 self-propelled artillery pieces. And then they shored them up with more armor that they welded on. This created a little pocket in the middle of the SPG that the Canadian infantry could then hunker down in, not standing up as they are in this picture where they're not in any danger. And as a result of being this pocket, they dubbed these vehicles kangaroos. And the kangaroo would save a lot of Canadian and British lives over the ensuing course of the war. In October, the SPGs were replaced by Ram tanks that had their turret taken off, and the gun taken out, and then the turret hollowed out, and the troops could go down inside there. On September 10th, the extensively prepared first attack on fortified port began, when 1st British Corps, with 2 infantry divisions supported by 2 tank brigades, assaulted Le Havre at the mouth of the Seine River. Before the assault began, 1,057 bombers hammered the city with 4,719 tons of explosives. As the bombs ceased falling, tanks and infantry prepared to roll over the crest of ground, concealing them from German view. Then they ground across these incredibly open farm fields towards the city itself. Now, the outcome of the battle for Le Havre was never in question. The British were bringing towards it about 36 to 40,000 men and tanks, and both the Germans and the Germans within the fortress and the attacking British knew that the 12,000 man garrison in the city could not possibly hold out against such strength. Despite the extensive networks of defenses, such as this one near the port, the British were able to isolate and confine the Germans to their fixed positions, and then they just eliminated each in turn. The battle ended with about 600 of the German garrison believed killed and 11,302 surrendering. British losses were amazingly light. There were 113 men killed, 3 missing, and 343 wounded. It was Le Havre's citizens that suffered far more. 80% of the city was left in ruins, 5,126 people were killed, and 31,000 were rendered homeless. The civilian losses here appalled the Canadian Army leadership and the British leadership as well. And so efforts are now made to bully the populations of Boulogne and Calais into evacuating to temporary Canadian Army refugee camps not far inland from their cities. With Le Havre taken, the weight of the funnies can now support a Canadian attack on Boulogne. But the Canadians can only bring to the operation nowhere near as strong a force as 1st British Corps had at Le Havre. Opening the Scheldt estuary has now become a priority, and so 2nd Canadian Corps sent all of its troops except 3rd Infantry Division to begin that operation. Needing to also contain Calais, 3rd Division has to send one of its brigades to that job. So it just has 2 brigades, the 8th and 9th, with limited tank support from 2nd Canadian Armoured Brigade. Even more so than at Le Havre, the Germans had very strong and well-placed defensive positions that were anchored on a number of fortresses. Because of the complex rolling terrain around Boulogne, there was only one viable line of approach, and knowing this, the Germans had concentrated their defensive construction on blocking that approach. The Germans numbered about 10,000 men. Normal World War II doctrine called for an attacking force to have 3 times the numbers of men to the defenders. With the attrition that 3rd Division's 2 brigades had suffered in Normandy, each fielded at best 3,500 men. So the Canadians were going into the attack effectively outnumbered. But most of them were soldiers who had been hardened by months of combat. Each man was able to think on his feet normally and operate with an independent confidence. And as we saw with the photos of Boulogne's destruction, they also had the aerial bomber support and artillery support. On September 17th, and if you look, you'll see a little summit in that photo, and you can see smoke coming up off of that summit. That's Mont Lambert. It was the cornerstone of the German defenses outside of Boulogne, and it was subjected to a furious aerial bombardment. But you can also see how extensively flat and level the ground is, and they have to go across that with their attack, and then hook around the right side of Mont Lambert to get into the city of Boulogne behind it. The fighting here for the control of Mont Lambert runs for about 2 days. It's incredibly heavily contested by the Germans, but the Canadians ultimately do win after a very difficult fight. After 6 days of intense combat, Boulogne falls, with the Germans giving up, and 9,517 of them march off to POW camps. Allied casualties totaled 634. The 6th Canadian Infantry Battalion suffered most, with 462 killed or wounded. There's no respite from the combat. 3 days later, 8th Canadian Infantry Brigade, fresh from Boulogne, and 7th Brigade, which had been containing the Calais garrison, went into the assault on that city and facing about 7,500 German defenders. At Boulogne, the Canadians had been hampered by rugged terrain. At Calais, they faced low-lying ground around the city, deliberately inundated by the Germans. So again, they're confined to a very narrow line of approach, and one that was heavily defended. Nevertheless, the attack soon began, progress was good, and the Canadians closed on the last defenses on the edge of Calais itself. One of the most bizarre moments in this battle came when the Winnipeg Rifles attacked ancient Fort Noulet. And if you look at it, you can see in the middle of that photo an actual drawbridge, and there's a wooden gate, doors, blocking that drawbridge, and there was a moat. The regiment's war diarist wrote that this was a very unusual battle for us, wherein all the science of modern warfare assembled to capture an ancient fort with stone wall, a moat, and a drawbridge. In 1900 hours, the little black devils gained a foothold on that bridge, and they moved 3 Pioneer Platoon Wasps, which were flame-throwing Bren carriers, forward. The Bren carriers smashed the doors down and burst inside. And Rifleman Harold Prout remembered, everything happened so fast. We just burst through, the Wasps started to burn everything in sight, and in minutes, the Germans poured out with their hands up to surrender. And that was when a problem arose. Canadians are now on the gates, at the gates of the city, and they learn that 20,000 civilians have refused the German commander's pleas for them to leave. With the German defenses inside the city slated for heavy bombardment by air and artillery, the Canadians opened up negotiations with the Germans to arrange a ceasefire of 2 days in order to enable the citizens to leave. On September 30th, thousands of civilians are reluctantly depart the city by being crammed into trucks and driven to refugee camps. Both German and Canadian truck drivers work side by side to form the long convoys to move them out. And when they get out there, the German drivers, once they're beyond the perimeter and have unloaded their civilians, they surrender and refuse to go back to the city. And in fact, the general commanding Calais, his personal chauffeur, they had used his staff car to move some French civilians, and he refused to go back. And the commander was furious, absolutely furious that his chauffeur would betray him that way. When hostilities resumed, the battle rapidly came to an end, with the Germans generally meekly waiting in their bunkers for the arrival of the now very tired Canadians, who went up, gathered them in as this platoon of North Shore New Brunswick Regiment did at a cross-channel gun position west of Sangat, which is on the city's outskirts. By 0900 hours on October 1st, it was all over. The German defenders proved more numerous than expected again. 7,500 were taken prisoner, an unconfirmed number were killed. Canadian casualties, just under 300. The day after the surrender, 3rd Division marched northward to join the Scheldt Estuary Campaign. On October 14th, Dieppe became the first channel port to open to Allied shipping, and this begins to greatly ease the materiel shortage that the British and Canadian armies had been facing. Although 1st Canadian Army would go on to suffer manpower shortages for the rest of the war, it would go on and fight in much more important and well-remembered and well-supplied campaigns. So its true Cinderella days were over, and it continued to fight these operations until victory came. Thank you.
Well done, Mark. Does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask of Mark? Are there any questions from the audience? Paul?
Yeah, the fortresses themselves were constructed with most of their big artillery facing the channel.
Yes.
Away from the rear assaults.
That's right.
That would have been an important factor in our success, perhaps?
Yeah, we probably wouldn't have succeeded if they'd all been still facing inland. They were able to get enough constructed to make the positions still quite deadly to come in against. but a good number of their very large coastal guns weren't able to rotate 360 degrees, but not all of them. Some of them could, and they were able to then fire inland. And so at each one, they had a number of the guns that could fire inland, and they also were able to take a lot of the lighter guns and remove them from the positions that they were in facing the coast and move them around so that they faced inland before we got there. Because once the Normandy invasion began, they started working really frantically to turn them into, to be able to repel an inland focused attack. And
Yes, exactly.
This isn't a military question, it's a question for a writer. I've read 4 of your books, and I've read other military books, and your books stand out because of that. We're right there as we read. Was that a decision that you made before you started writing, or
Yes.
did it just happen?
No, I decided that very much before I started writing. I think when I was young, I was inspired by Cornelius Ryan and his writings, and he did that to some degree. And I thought, well, this is what makes these readable, Cornelius Ryan's books. And I was very much wanting to create a situation where we could, as we were reading it, we would feel like we were there with the soldiers, whether they be generals or privates. Yep.
Mark, we saw in Calais the effect that the bombers had, effectively making the city more difficult to assault than it otherwise might have been. And yet we see repeatedly in the Channel ports Bomber Command playing a role in purportedly destroying German fortifications. Surely the Canadian Army's leadership was doubtful that that might succeed, and you yourself in the summary in the Legion magazine, some of it's read yesterday,
Right.
make the point that they created a similar amount of rubble in the streets, all kinds of opportunities for machine guns to lurk in the rubble and so on. Why did they believe Bomber Command when it said that we can hit that bunker and make the street passable?
Well, I think there was a tendency to just want to embrace that as a possibility, because they were going into these attacks against these fortifications. We didn't have, the Allies in the West didn't have experience in conducting major siege operations, and that's what these were. And they were also under a great gun to get this job done quickly, because Montgomery was wanting to get these ports opened immediately. So they just sort of grasped at every carrot that was offered to them and hoped that the Bomber Command would come through. It didn't, of course, as you say. In Boulogne, once they get inside the city, they have a very hard time moving their convoys, their attack convoys, forward through the rubble, because they have to pick their way around all this destruction. And they start to realize that it's not a good plan. And we don't see Bomber Command after the Channel ports being given the tasks of heavy bombardments on cities anymore that are going to be attacked. And I think they finally got the message. But sometimes leadership can be a bit of a slow learner.
Yeah.
Mark, is there any one reason why the Canadian Army, its achievements were never fully recognized or properly appreciated?
I think generally what happened is the British sort of took us for granted. The Americans didn't care about us at all. And if you look at the histories, you look at the American histories of operations in Normandy and that, the Canadians seldom get mentioned at all. We just don't even figure in it. The British, it's not much better. I found it interesting looking at 1st British Corps, which served under the 1st Canadian Army, that there's nobody in Britain who has written a history of that corps. Because they were with us, they're just forgotten. And so we were forgotten, they're forgotten. Montgomery had a tendency to take the Canadians for granted. And he hated Crerar, who was our commander, so he wasn't going to give any credit to anything that Crerar did. So there was this, you start getting this stereotype built that the Canadians, they were doing a job, but it wasn't really that important a job. And you see that in a way accepted at the end of World War II when we start working on our own histories, that there's not, it's almost a bit apologetic at times about what we did, and that maybe we could have done a better job and stuff. And to a large extent, I guess I'm coming around trying to correct that vision, or at least I'll offer a different vision, because I think the Canadians did wonderful work, always with under-resourced, and it was really in the end the grit and the courage of our troops that pulled victory after victory out of the hat.
Yeah, Dana?
Mark, perhaps outside of the scope, but a question that sort of begs to be asked. What happened with these thousands and tens of thousands of German prisoners? I mean, there must have been an amazing logistical chain to feed them, shelter, pen them, discipline, guard. It must have been quite the organization not far back.
Yeah.
Is that a Canadian responsibility?
The Canadians fairly quickly turned it over to the 21st Army Group, had a whole network that was designed to take in the prisoners. They had to be moved back, as you say, ultimately to the beaches of Normandy, because again, we're still bringing everything across the sand, so that you bring the supplies in and you take those Germans and you move them out as quickly as possible. Most of them ended up in Britain, and then ultimately a lot of them ended up in Canada, some in Ontario here and a lot in Alberta. But what's interesting with German troops is when they surrendered, they became very docile on a whole, and they didn't have to worry about these guys trying to escape because the Germans just tended not to do so. They would just, we've now surrendered. Trump. We go back to go wherever you tell us to. So it was very different than taking Allied troops prisoner, where a lot of them would be looking for an opportunity to get away. So they didn't have to be guarded that much. In fact, in the Channel ports and in the Normandy to some extent too, we were so low in manpower that we couldn't to even send a person to guard these guys in the return to the back lines was too much of a taxing. And so often they would just say, throw down all your guns and go that way. And the Germans would trudge off. And eventually someone in the rear would pick them up and take control of them. Because, you think about it, you got 9,000 surrendering Germans and they outnumber you. Yeah. You've got to count on their docility and complicity in being prisoners.
Maybe a book there.
Yeah.
Yeah, my father told me about that.
Yeah.
I thought he was just joking.
No, it's very true.
About seeing all these Germans come down the road and unarmed and just on their way back.
Yeah.
Excellent. I'd like to call the questions this time, and I'd like to ask Jim Lutz, as the senior representative of the RCMI, to present a token of our appreciation. There you are, Jim.
Thank you very much. Military history is happily very alive and well in Canada, but an awful lot of it these days is at the political and social level. But the heart of military history still has to be the campaign or operational history. And thank heavens we have you, Mark, to do that. You mentioned that you're working on yet another campaign which no one else has written about. So we thank you very much for coming today. And when that book is ready, we look forward to having you come back and tell us about that campaign, which hopefully is not the last. Don't run out of campaigns. Okay, so
got a little bit of leverage yet. Thank you very much.
Right.
Thank you.
This has been another in our series of webcasts produced by the Royal Canadian Military Institute in Toronto as a public educational service. You can find news of upcoming events and links to our webcast archives on our website at www.rcmi.org. On behalf of the Institute, this is Eric Morse saying goodbye for now, and thanks for joining us.